So Ron, thank you so much for speaking with me today. So what first piqued your interest in animals?
You know, ever since I was a little kid, I grew up in a small apartment in New York City. My father was a Cuban immigrant. The only exposure I got to animals back then growing up was a small little 12-inch black and white television set. And I watched this show every Sunday night called Mutual of Omaha's Wild Kingdom. And I watched these animals, a guy named Jim Fowler on that show, and I said, man, this is incredible. And it was just on this little black and white screen. I said, Mom, I want to know more about these animals. And then I went to the Bronx Zoo. And going to the Bronx Zoo, my mom took me by train. We went to the Bronx Zoo, and there's something to be said about when you look at an animal eye to eye. There's pictures of me as 3-4-year-old kid training the squirrels in New York City to come eat out of my hands and kind of engaging with this wildlife, this urban wildlife in New York City. So ever since I can remember, I've been fascinated by animals, and I knew that I wanted to work with them when I grew up.
So what's the difference about going to a zoo versus seeing an animal in a video?
You know, there's just some connection that happens there. I think it's something like, you know, you can look at your favorite actor on television, but when you see that person in person and you look at them in the eye, there's a reality to it that really strikes home. It's a connection that's very hard to describe in words. It's just something that happens. It's like, you know, you can see the Grand Canyon in a book or in posters or in documentaries. And then you go to the Grand Canyon and there's just something there. There's something that just supersedes all these conceptions you had about it and makes an indelible impact.
So clearly throughout your career, you've had a lot of experiences with a lot of different animals. But what I'm most interested in was your time with Miami Vice. What exactly did you do for the show?
You know, there was a famous alligator on Miami Vice. His name was Elvis. This was Don Johnson's pet. That was the whole shtick. I mean, when that show came about, it was very innovative. Everything was precedent setting. So you had these two cops who dressed up in Gucci clothes and drove Ferraris, and he lived on a sailboat, and he had an alligator as a pet. Of course, he's a Florida vice detective, has an alligator as a pet. It was so out the door, but it's what helps sell it. Well, I was one of the handlers of Elvis the alligator. For the record, there were about 5 different Elvises, depending on the shot we were doing. We had a smaller Elvis for inside the sailboat, a bigger Elvis for outside the sailboat. And I also handled all the other animals. There was a team of us, but I handled all the other animals. We had everything from black leopards to cobras. Anytime you saw a fish tank set up in a psychologist office or something like that, I set up the fish tank. So it was really an incredible introduction to working with animals for television, and quite frankly, I was very spoiled. I was young back then. I was in, you know, my, late 20s, and it was a fortune. I was making more money working on that show once a month than I made all year working at the zoo.
Wow. So of all the animals you've ever worked with, which is the one that's most surprisingly difficult to deal with? It could be a single animal or a type of animal.
You know, I don't know if there's anyone that's more difficult to work with. Some are a difficult challenge to study. I mean, I have, you know, one of my favorite animals, if there is such a thing, is the harpy eagle. It's the most powerful bird of prey in the world. It's found in the beautiful tropical forest of tropical America. And I was one of the few people at the time that actually was able to climb 120 feet up a tree and sit in the nest of one with a chick in this pristine rainforest in the Panamanian rainforest. And that's an animal, because it's so elusive and so secretive and hard to watch. The challenge was getting to observe it, to watch it and to study it. But the payoff was just being in that forest. I mean, looking at these animals, running into everything from tapirs to, you know, boas to all kinds of animals in that jungle. It was an incredible challenge, but an incredibly rewarding.
So Ron, what exactly is conservation?
You know, conservation is making people understand. There's an old saying that says, we have not inherited this earth from our parents, we are borrowing it from our children. And the premise of that is to say that what we see here today, it's our responsibility to make sure it's there for our kids tomorrow and their kids after that. We have to conserve that, we have to protect it, and in order to protect it, we have to conserve certain things, whether it be water usage, whether it be forest and habitats. You have to protect those things. They're not an infinite resource, you know, and I think that's changing now. I think people are seeing that, because when I was a kid, I never heard about recycling. I drove the biggest, baddest hot rod in the world. It got like -7 miles to the gallon. You drive a car like that today and they give you a dirty look. Now it's cool to drive a Prius, an electric car.
Which I happen to drive.
There you go. And that's a reflection on your generation. That's, to me, a great sign of hope, because I think your generation, the millennials especially, are starting to understand that, listen, we've got to protect this stuff. I don't see as many people getting caught up in the materialism of things as they are, hey, the environment. We have to protect the environment. We have to conserve this. It's not, again, an infinite resource. So by doing so, that's conservation. That's understanding that we don't own anything. We're just borrowing it. We have to protect it. We have to conserve it to make sure it's there for the future.
So what does the Ron Magil Conservation Fund do?
The Ron Magil Conservation Endowment is something I came up with because, Tasia, I came to work at the zoo over 38 years ago, but I didn't come to work here to work for an attraction. I didn't come to work here to just have a place where people come see animals on exhibits and that's about it. I came here to work for a place that was going to make a difference to protect those animals in the wild. If we're going to spend millions of dollars on zoo exhibits and we don't allocate a certain percentage of that money to protecting those very animals in the wild, that's hypocrisy to me. That's not conservation. That's just entertainment, okay? So I just felt I needed to do more for conservation. And I wanted to leave some kind of legacy in the sense that, I mean, it's embarrassing for me to say this, but I have to say it because it's honest. You know, I have a bit of an ego. I've been here for 38 years and I started saying to myself, what was I going to leave behind? What was going to be the legacy? I said, I don't want to just move away and that's it, I'm done, and what do you leave behind? So by creating an endowment, and by definition, an endowment is a corpus of money that can never be touched, but that money produces dividends and interest that then can be used for certain things. And what that does is it guarantees, since that money's never touched, it's there forever. It keeps producing money. But to create an endowment, you really have to have at least $1 million. $1 million in an endowment can produce anywhere from $60,000 or more a year that you can use and still have your $1 million. So I wanted to create this endowment to make sure that we're taking care of animals in the wild. All the proceeds from this endowment go to conservation of animals in the wild. Not anything at the zoo, not anything here on this property. It's not for any captive animals, any animals under human care, however you want to phrase it. It is for protecting animals in the wild. Because the saddest thing in the world would be if the zoo were the last place where you can see these animals. So the endowment was created that way. It's the thing I'm most proud of in my entire career, that I've been able to go to personal friends, acquaintances that I've had, and tell them about this dream. And they've donated personally to where there's now over $1.6 million in that endowment.
So clearly it's very important to conserve wildlife around the world, around the whole globe. But tell me about the wildlife here in Miami, South Florida. What is the state of wildlife here?
You know, that's a great question because Florida is a very unique place. Florida is a melting pot for all kinds of wildlife. In our own backyard, we have some of those beautiful exotic wildlife in the world. Everything, Florida panthers, alligators, otters, bears, all kinds of snakes, all kinds of incredible wading birds. The life here is amazing. But what makes this area so welcoming to that wildlife also makes it welcoming to a lot of non-native wildlife. And there's a big problem now because people in South Florida especially love to have exotic pets. And over the years they have released those exotic pets. And those exotic pets now have created a problem by establishing themselves in our native environment and challenging the native wildlife to the point where they're wiping out some of the native wildlife. Probably the iconic animal in that respect is the python. Everybody hears about the python, but there are a lot of other animals that are doing this. A lot of plants, a lot of insects. And these things can cost us millions, maybe billions of dollars if we don't control them.
So that was one of my main questions actually. Are invasive species necessarily bad? Because it could be argued that maybe the new species would be good for the environment.
Once a species is labeled as invasive, it's bad. Because what it's doing is it's displacing native species. Now, there's a difference between an invasive species and a non-native species. We have some non-native species that right now people are saying they're not seeming to do any damage, they're seeming to coexist with the native wildlife. So they're non-native, but they're not considered invasive. Invasive, however, pretty much equates to destructive in the sense that it's going in, it's wiping out native wildlife, and that in the long run, you can't predict in the long run what that's going to do, but more often than not, it's a bad thing. For instance, we got the pythons. Let's use them as examples everybody knows about. They're going out there wiping out rabbits in certain areas. So there's no more rabbits in this one area now. Well, people say, okay, so there's no rabbits. There's still rabbits over here. Yeah, but in this area, these rabbits ate plants. They swallowed the seeds, they moved along, they pooped out those seeds, they planted these plants. They were a dispersal method for plant life. Now the rabbits are gone. That plant life's not dispersing. Not only that, now the grasses that they ate to keep grasses low for other animals to survive in are now growing out of control. The habitat's changed completely. This all turns into a snowball effect. You don't know how far down the line it's going to go before an entire environment is totally changed.
So in addition to invasive species, what kind of threat does climate change pose to wildlife here in South Florida? Something we need to worry about now?
Absolutely, we need to worry about it. First of all, we've got sea level rise. Sea level rise, part of this climate change. When you talk about, most of the fresh water in the world is in ice. And as that ice is melting on the Arctic poles, the Antarctic poles, the sea levels are rising. When that sea level rises, if you got a piece of property on Miami Beach, that might be a concern of yours down the line. With temperatures rising, we're having things like bleaching out events on our coral reefs. The temperature of the water rises. Algae takes over the reefs, and reefs die. If you just put all the wildlife aside, Tage, just put it aside and think nothing about caring about animals. Think about the tourist dollars of people who come here to South Florida to go diving to see our reefs, how much money they spend, what an economic engine that is. What happens when the reefs are gone, when the reefs are dead, and nobody's coming back to do that?
So it's not just an environmental issue, it's an issue for everyone in all walks of life.
Absolutely. If you don't even care at all about animals, but you care about economy, you care about your quality of life, you better care about the environment, especially here in South Florida, where tourism is such an economic engine.
Well, speaking of tourism, I know you calling a lot to Miami Beach, and that was something I wanted to talk about today is your time with the Dan Le Batard show. How did you first get involved with that? It's awesome.
That was funny because they called me once off the cuff. Dan is he's a genius. And he called me off the cuff to say, I think it was World Cup or Super Bowl, and they were talking about mascots. No, I know what it was. It was the Final Four. And they're talking about animal mascots. They say, okay, Ron, if the mascots were fighting each other, it was like the Kansas Jayhawks against, I don't know, the Georgia Bulldogs or something. A Jayhawk against a Bulldog, who's going to win? And it was an off-the-cuff, tongue-in-cheek thing where we started putting mascots fighting each other and battling who would win. And it just kind of took off. I mean, I had no expectation. He called me back and said, listen, that was great. We're going to do it again. And then we did it every week. We just had this animal segment. And then he gave me my own segment. And Dan and Stugatz and those guys, they did it. And then all of a sudden ESPN says, hey, listen, we're going to take your show national. I said, okay, I'm done. And Dan goes, absolutely not. This show's going national because they want Miami. You're with me. And that was 6 years ago, something like that. And we've been going strong ever since. I mean, every day I think, Tage, the show I'm doing is the last show. They're going to say, okay, that's enough. We've done enough. We've beaten this horse to the ground. And every day, no, the callers are calling off the hook. They send me all these tweets and all this stuff of the people tweeting, this is great, this is fantastic. And at the end of the day, though we do a lot of things tongue-in-cheek, the goal is we're giving some people some good information too. And we're attracting an audience that I might not otherwise attract. These might not be the people who watch National Geographic. They might not be the people who watch, the BBC, but they're people who love sports. It's, to Dan's credit, he gives me a tremendous outlet to help educate the public about wildlife.
So speaking about that good information, I know a lot of times you come on the show and you talk about and discuss these misconceptions. So what are maybe 2 or 3 of the biggest animal misconceptions you want our audience to know?
Well, I think, we've all heard the term the wise old owl. And I hear that all the time. You go to graduations, you go to the library, you'll see a picture of an owl with a graduation cap. It's the wise old owl, the very intelligent owl. The reality is the owl is probably one of the least intelligent of the birds. You look at the eyes of an owl, they're huge, and those huge eyes take in a lot of space in the skull. Because they take up so much space in the skull, there's very little space left for the brain. So in reality, it's not the wise old owl. It's really not very wise at all. I won't go as far as Dan does to call it stupid, but it's not very wise. Something like a porcupine. People think porcupines shoot their quills at you. Porcupines do not shoot their quills at you. It's impossible for them to do that. They back up into you and they release the quills that have little barbs on the end so they hurt, they're painful, but they don't shoot their quills at you. All snakes are not venomous. Snakes do not chase you down. There's no snake that can go faster than a human being. People just love to sensationalize and blow things out of proportion.
Is there any one animal that's more menacing maybe in reality than it actually is?
Yeah,
in media?
The human being. That's about it. I tell you, I tell people all the time, if you properly respect an animal, you should have no reason to fear it. If I've traveled around the world. I've been to Africa over 50 times. I've come face to face with grizzly bears in Alaska, with lions in Africa, and I've never had a problem with them. I've always kept my distance, kept my respect. They don't want anything to do with me. People just need to understand that and respect it. You should have more fear of a stray dog in the street than you do of an alligator in your canal.
Thank you so much for talking to me today. I learned a lot, and I hope our audience did also.
My pleasure, Tage. Thanks for the opportunity.